we've got all these things that are details that we have to work through as we're reading through these particular passages. Let's keep going. Dr. Walvoord contrasting against, or what should we say, refuting post-trib theology, says in verse 2, speaking of Paul, so we're talking about this passage out of Thessalonians. Verse 2, he says, "For you yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord shall cometh as a thief in the night." He's talking about 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 2. "You yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord cometh as a thief in the night." Now, let's keep going. Much has been said about this figure of speech, right? The day of the Lord, and thief in the night. Paul expresses that they already knew what he meant by it. Obviously, Walvoord says, he is saying that they knew that the day of the Lord was certainly coming, but like a thief in the night, there was no way to date it. So just like the rapture, the day of the Lord commences unexpectedly, unannounced, as it were. When I say unannounced, I mean from the perspective of the world, they're not looking for it, so it is quite like a thief, unannounced, and yet it's because they are in darkness. Contrastingly, we Christians are not in darkness. We're children of the light, like Paul told us in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, and thus being in the light, this day will not overtake us like a thief. And according to many pre-rapturists, like myself, there's a hint of the fact that we're going to be removed prior to rapture when he says that the day will not overtake us. I pulled the passage again in case you're not following. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, starting in verse 4, speaking to believers, "But you, brothers and sisters, are not in darkness, so that the day would overtake you like a thief." We're not in darkness, so it's the spiritual mindset, but it's also that there could be a hint where he's saying that the day would not overtake us, meaning, why wouldn't it overtake us? Because we will have been removed prior to it even commencing. He could also be meaning like those who believe in the sheltering in place, the Goshen principle, that he's merely talking about the spiritual application of it not overtaking us like a thief. Rather, it will overtake us, but the emphasis on the not like a thief part of us, because we're not children of the darkness. So where is the emphasis? Is it that it will not overtake us at all? Or is it that it will overtake us, but it won't take us like a thief? We've got that extra clause there at the end that kind of is modifying the would not overtake us. That's the point I'm trying to bring up. So back to Walvoord. So he says the rapture and the day of the Lord are both events that, from the world's perspective, are going to overtake them, but obviously they're not going to be included in the rapture. By comparison, those of us who are believers, not only will it not overtake us like a thief, but we will also recognize the signs, and we will be anticipating it, and Paul's going to tell us that we should look up, raise our heads. No, that's Jesus in Luke. We should raise our heads because our redemption is drawing nigh, is drawing near. So when you see these things happening, look up, right? With anticipation. The blessed hope is about to happen. What is that blessed hope? Our redemption, our resurrection, our rescue, our deliverance, the rapture, or at the very least, the going up real quick and coming back down and then being sheltered in place, one way or the other. We're going to not have to suffer the brunt of the wrath from God, or God will protect us supernatural, but that's kind of a weak argument in my opinion. So Walvoord talks about, he says, in Paul's discussion that follows, a sharp contrast is drawn between the day of the Lord as it relates to the unsaved and as it relates to the Christians. It's the whole idea of the pronouns that we're going to be looking at right now. Walvoord brings this out beautifully. He says this is brought out in the use of the first and second persons, we, us, and you, in verses 1 to 2, 4 to 6, and 8 through 11, and then the third person, they and others, in verse 3 and 6 to 7. This is 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 that he's interacting with. In verse 3 of 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, the day of the Lord is pictured as coming on the unbelievers like travail on a woman with child, so that they cannot escape, just as a woman cannot escape birth pangs. This, by the way, is reminiscent of Jesus' language in Matthew chapter 24's Olivet Discourse, where he talks about these are the beginnings of sorrows, but other translations render the Greek as these are the beginnings of birth pangs. Walvoord continues, Paul further states that their destruction will come at a time when they, speaking of the wicked world, is saying peace and safety. Now, listen up very carefully, because this is very strong common sense that we're going to be talking about. Gundry, who's a post-tribber, does not explain why they will be saying peace and safety toward the end of the Great Tribulation, as it does not fit into his view. Because Gundry thinks that rapture is going to happen at the very end, and then there'll be a very quick battle of Armageddon, and we'll usher in the millennial kingdom. So why would the world be saying peace and safety? He doesn't explain it very well. Payne has no problem with this and regards it as a sense of false security that exists today in spite of atomic bombs and the danger of Holocaust. Payne's another post-tribber. So, or I'm thinking might be a post-tribber, but he defines the peace and safety saying by the world as a sense of false security. However, notice what Dr. Walvoord, who's a pre-tribber, says, which I agree with, even though I'm not a pre-tribber. I agree with his line of reasoning. Listen to this. The idea that the expression, the idea that the expression saying peace and safety refers to the longing for peace and safety on the part of those who are in the Great Tribulation is not an acceptable explanation and rejected by both post-tribulationists and pre-tribulationists, right? The fact that Gundry is faced with a real problem of trying to fit this into a scheme with the day of the Lord beginning toward the end of the Great Tribulation. 1 Thessalonians 5 states that people will be saying peace and safety before the Great Tribulation begins. That's undeniable. We've got that sentiment as expressed by Paul. And notice what Walvoord mentions next as a pre-tribber. He says, this is in harmony with pre-tribulationism, but quite out of harmony with post-tribulationism. And the reason I'm highlighting that is because the world crying peace and safety during the time of the tribulation is in harmony with the idea that during the tribulation, the man of lawlessness, the Antichrist himself, will be providing for the world by and large, for the most part, because they have taken the mark and they have sworn their allegiance to him and rejected the means of salvation offered by God. So for the most part, yes, despite the fact that all around us there will be wars, rumors of wars, famines, pestilence, everything mentioned in the beginnings of birth pains. Besides the fact that Jesus mentioned all those things in the earlier part of the tribulation, the world will still have a sense of peace and security, especially even after the midpoint when Antichrist turns on Israel and turns on the Christians, but the rest of the world is going to be enjoying his protection and his provision, because he will have access to all of the world's resources as one central government, right? His 10-nation coalition, the eighth beast empire that will be ruling the world at the time of the New World Order. And as long as you take the mark, then everything will be fine. You'll be taken care of. You'll be provided for. You'll be protected to some extent. So it'll be tribulation for Jews and Christians, but not necessarily for the world at large. Sure, there'll be lots of stuff that God is sending, but it won't feel like wrath, because the wrath will not have been taken place yet, according to my understanding. And even according to pre-tribbers, the bulk of the wrath of God, the heaviest hitting part of it, won't have taken place either. So, peace and safety makes sense when you think about that it's the world saying, thank you, Mr. Antichrist, for providing for us. Obviously, they're not thanking God, right? It is a false peace from the perspective of it's temporal, it's not lasting, it's not genuine. But to the degree that they are trusting in Antichrist, it will be genuine, and it'll be all that they care about. So, that's the perspective that Walvoord's trying to say that Gundry is missing, because Gundry is a post-tribber, and he's putting all of the rapture and peace and safety saying smash towards the very end of the tribulation period. Let's finish Walvoord here. I have to accelerate this because I'm running out of time in my hour. Looks like I'm going to go a few minutes over. Paul states, this is Walvoord speaking again, Paul states that the day of the Lord will not overtake the Thessalonians as a thief. Why does an event coming as a thief come expectedly on the world, but with proper expectation for believers? We can answer part of that question, by the way, because Jesus himself told us that we as believers have this blessed hope, and that we know, well, he didn't use the word blessed hope, that's Paul's language, but he told us as believers that there will be this expectation, and that when summer's near, or when the fig tree gives its leaves, then we know that summer's near, and we know that the events are about to take place, and therefore the signs, like the sixth seal signs, sun, moon, stars, great earthquake, things like that. Joel's, not Joel Richardson, but the book of Joel talks about these Day of the Lord signs. Those are an indicator that not only is the day of the Lord about to commence, but that the rapture itself is also going to commence. And then we have the sign of that's what we might call the sign of the end of the age. And then after that, we have the sign of the Son of Man appearing in the sky, which is the lightning flashing from the east to the west. And that's what Jesus gave to us in Matthew chapter 24, starting at about around verse 30 and then 31. The sun will be dark and the moon will give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and then they'll see the sign of the Son of Man appearing in the sky. All the tribes of the earth will mourn. So that's the classic rapture language that we pre-wrathers lock onto in Matthew chapter 24. Even though pre-tribbers reject that part of Matthew as a rapture passage, they think that's Armageddon language. Nevertheless, the coming unexpectedly as a thief in the night shows up later on in Matthew. And when we get down to starting in verse 36 and moving on to around verse 42, something like that. And it's that day, that coming as a thief in the night language, that pre-tribbers pick up on and say, aha, this is Armageddon language. Thief in the night. Yep, that's Armageddon. But, I'm sorry, Armageddon. Nope, that's Rapture, not Armageddon. That's Rapture. But they do recognize that that same language can apply to Armageddon. So let's keep reading Walvoord's notes. So Paul explains, we're looking at 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and 5. Paul states that the day of the Lord won't overtake the Thessalonians like a thief. Why does this event coming unexpectedly on the world, the day of the Lord? Paul explains this why in verse 4 and 5, why the day of the Lord happens like a thief in the night for unbelievers. Quote, but you, brothers, are not in darkness so that this day should surprise you like a thief. You are all sons of light and sons of the day. We do not belong to the night nor to the darkness. That's the NIV version. So pre-tribbers say, no, we're not going to be surprised. It will overtake the world like a thief in the night, but we're not children of the night, we're children of the day. And then look at what Walvoord says. He says, here's a crucial point in Paul's explanation. The thief is going to come in the night, but the believers are declared not to belong to the night or the darkness. The implication, he says, it's quite clear that believers are in a different time reference, namely that they belong to the day that precedes the darkness. Okay, so he's just using Paul's words, taking at face value to symbolize the fact that spiritually, the believers have the Holy Spirit, and so we're not going to be completely caught off guard when the event of the rapture happens, or even if we were to take a post-trib, even when the day of the Lord happens. And of course, Walvoord can say this because in his view, which I agree with, the rapture and the day of the Lord are back-to-back events. They happen simultaneously. One happens first and the other happens immediately on the heels of it or very, very close to it. And I think he's going to say this later on in his teaching, so I'll just keep reading. On this basis, Walvoord says, Paul gives an exhortation. If the Thessalonians are of the day, they are not to be asleep or drugged. Rather, they are to be sober or self-controlled, putting on faith and love as a breastplate and the hope of salvation as a helmet, verse 8 out of the NIV. He continues, Paul concludes in verse 9, quote, for God did not appoint us to suffer wrath, but to receive salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ, NIV. And again, I just have to highlight that given the context, if you read it in a natural way, the wrath that Paul's talking about here is not the eternal wrath that all believers are saved from. This is true. Rather, by context, the immediate wrath that Paul just referred to in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 is the eschatological wrath of God that's going to be poured out when? On the day of the Lord, which is also mentioned explicitly in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. So that when we get to verse 9, later on down into the chapter, he has already talked about the day of the Lord and the destruction that's going to come upon the wicked. And yet, by contrast from the wicked, he says that we, believers, children of the day, are not destined to wrath. So I don't know why the post-tribbers come along and say that this wrath is a reference to the eternal wrath. I agree with the bigger picture that it is true, but in the smaller context, let's keep it centered on the eschatological wrath, the day of the Lord, which is poured out on living human beings, not dead people. Okay, so let's keep reading Dr. Walvoord's notes. In the exegesis of this verse about 1 Thessalonians chapter 9, pre-tribbers and post-tribbers part company. Post-tribbers Walvoord doesn't say post-tribber, he says post-tribulationists, insist that the church is not appointed to wrath, and with this, all pre-tribulationists agree. And so he's going to highlight what I just mentioned. What the passage is talking about, however, is not the wrath in the abstract, right? When we say abstract, we're talking about the eternal wrath of God that we're saved from all eternity, where God will punish the wicked for all eternity in eternal separation from God. That's what we mean by the abstract version of wrath. What Walvoord correctly identifies is that Paul is not talking about wrath in the abstract, but a time of wrath. He continues, the judgment poured out in the tribulation do not single out unsaved people only, for war, pestilence, famine, earthquakes, and stars falling from heaven afflict the entire population, except for the 144,000 of Revelation singled out by God for special protection. So remember, Walvoord believes that tribulation and wrath are synonymous terms. If we go back over to the chart for pre-trib, we see that the entire 7-year time frame, according to most pre-tribbers, is the tribulation period, which is broken up into tribulation, great tribulation, but they all equal God's wrath. And so from Walvoord's perspective, when you read through the events of the tribulation at the beginning of the 3.5 years, at all of that, all of those events are poured out on all of humanity. The first 4 seals of the 7, right? The 4 horses of the apocalypse that we call, that we read in the book of Revelation chapter 6. All of those seals happen to humans. Indeed, because the seals in the book of Revelation have a direct parallel to the events described by Jesus in Matthew chapter 24's Olivet Discourse. Mark 13 also has it, Luke 17 and Luke 21. Those are all Olivet Discourse resources. They all describe the same events happening on believers only? No. Happening on wicked, unrepentant sinners only? No. They happen to everyone. They happen to everyone in the world. Indeed, they're all kind of general, what the world might almost call natural disasters. A lot of them are just kind of the natural course of the world. Even wars, even though it's caused by humans, we still say that this is a kind of a natural course of nation rising up against nation. In other words, we can remove the supernatural element out of the first 4 seals for the most part. Yeah, and I hold that. I think that's quite accurate perspective. So when we go back over to Walvoord, he begins to explain this idea that if we're talking about the day of the Lord and the first part that's poured out on everyone in the world, well, then it would make sense that, how did he describe it? It would make sense that Paul is not talking about wrath in the abstract, but rather wrath as a specific time. And the reason this makes sense is because wrath as an abstract is specifically, uniquely reserved for unrepentant sinners, those who are outside of Christ, those who are unbelievers. Wrath in the abstract sense of eternal wrath. Or we could interpret it a different way. When he just says wrath as an abstract, he's just talking about God's angry punishment against people who disobey him. Right? He could be talking about that, but I think he's talking more about the eternal wrath near the end of the judgment time period that Paul's definitely not talking about. Let's keep going. Walvoord says, here, however, the believer in Christ is assured that his appointment is not this time of wrath. Again, I believe, like Walvoord, that Paul is referring in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 9 to the idea when he says, God hath not appointed us to wrath. I think that the context is the day of the Lord, which is a time period that's poured out on planet Earth on wicked humans who are still alive so that they can actually suffer and pay for, with retribution, like God says, pay for the way they have rejected God and have been persecuting Christians. It's that type of wrath that is in view, I believe. So, God exempts his own children from that type of wrath and punishment. In attempting to explain this, the pre-tribulationist has the obvious advantage, which is, if the church is raptured before this time of trouble, and all that is said in this passage becomes very clear, which is, that is, the period of wrath will not overtake the church as a thief, because the church will not be there. To which I agree. I just disagree with the timing for the pre-tribbers, but I agree with the theology there. If Gundry, who is a post-tribber, if his use of the argument from silence is valid, it would seem here that Paul's silence on the matter of whether the church must endure this period is again another indication that the church will not even enter the period. Let's continue. Let's finish tonight. Walvoord continues, when we take the total picture of this passage into consideration, the reason for Paul's introducing it becomes clearer, right? We're talking about the idea interacting with a post-trib view of 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5 and a pre-trib view of 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5, and we're using Dr. John Walvoord's notes, who is a prominent pre-tribber, and we're contrasting that primarily against Gundry, who is a post-tribber. And I myself am a pre-wrather, right? So I'm outside of both of those two camps. But in this particular discussion for now, I'm finding myself agreeing more with the pre-tribber position only because of certain aspects. Again, I don't toss pre-trib out completely, nor do I toss any of the other two views. So of the four main views, of which I am a pre-wrather, the other three views have some theology that I hold to. Right, yeah, that's only common sense. But Walvoord says, when we take the total picture of 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5 into consideration, the reason for Paul's introducing, when we're talking about chapter 5 and the day of the Lord, it becomes clear we're having this discussion about the timing of the rapture and its relationship to the day of the Lord, which pre-tribbers believe they are back-to-back, pre-wrathers believe they are back-to-back, and post-tribbers believe they are also probably back-to-back, but the timing is at the far end. He continues, Walvoord, although the events of the day of the Lord do not begin immediately after the rapture, the time period as such following the symbolism of a day beginning at midnight could easily be understood to begin with the rapture itself. And when he says, although the events of the day of the Lord do not begin immediately after the rapture, I don't have a problem with that either. When I say that the rapture initiates the day of the Lord, or the rapture and the day of the Lord begin on the same day, we don't have to have them. We don't have to have wrath falling as soon as the Christians disappear from sight in the air, although it could be that way. But Walvoord's saying that the events of the day of the Lord do not begin immediately after the rapture. He's saying that there could be maybe a gap of a day or 12 hours, or, who can know exactly. We could all be wrong, but at least I believe it's the same day, because Jesus gave us examples from the book of Genesis, Noah and Lot, and in those examples, it is definitely destruction that falls on the wicked humanity, on wicked humans, on the same day that Noah is rescued into the ark and the same day that Lot is delivered out of Sodom and Gomorrah. Fire and brimstone rain down on the very same day. So I believe that principle is true, that it is the same day, but Walvoord says it doesn't happen immediately after the rapture. I don't know if I completely agree with that statement itself, but let's keep reading. He says, the opening hours of the day of the Lord do not contain great events. So now he just separates it by a few hours. Gradually, the major events of the day of the Lord unfold, climaxing in the terrible judgments with which the great tribulation is brought to conclusion. So, I think he could be meaning when he says the events of the day of the Lord. If you read what happens on the day of the Lord, and if you use your notes, if you borrow your notes from the book of Revelation, starting at about chapter 6 with the opening of the 6th seal, and then we've got the 7th seal, which contains the 7 trumpets, and then the 7th trumpet, which contains the 7 bowls. So if you use the book of Revelation, starting in chapter 6 with the 6th seal, which is the sign of the sun, moons, and stars, and then from there you move into chapter 7, and then chapter 8, and then all the way to about chapter 15, really, to catch the full weight of all of the day of the Lord, you'll find that there are quite a number of events that comprise the day of the Lord that can't well, they could, but it's highly unlikely that they would all be collapsed into a single 24-hour day. Understand what I'm saying? So when we say the day of the Lord, we're not talking about a 24-hour day, like as in the Lord's Day that Christians call, which is Sunday, or something like that. We're not talking about a 24-hour time period in its most general sense of the word. We're talking about an event known as the Day of the Lord that contains many events that are played out over a course of time. And I think that's maybe what Walvoord's trying to mean when he says, although the events of the Day of the Lord do not begin immediately after the rapture. He's talking about all of the things that are played out. He continues, taken as a whole, the pre-tribulational point of view gives sense and meaning to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and explains why this is introduced after the rapture, which I hold to, by the way. In effect, listen up, Paul is saying that the time of the rapture cannot be determined any more than the time of the beginning of the day of the Lord, which is why we're talking so prominently about the day of the Lord at this moment while we're supposed to be talking about rapture. I've got to get this information out of the way first, because from here on out, when we start talking about pre-wrath, in the name pre-wrath and in the name pre-trib is this idea that there is trouble ahead that we Christians are exempt from. And so we've got to get this idea of what the trouble is and how it is related to a need for rapture. Otherwise, like a lot of people who are dissatisfied with that word rapture, why do we even need to be rescued if God has the power to protect us through the entire thing? It renders rapture meaningless. In some sense. Why does God need to yank us up into the air for a little bit and then plop us right back down and then pour out Armageddon judgments in the day of the Lord? I mean, can't he just shelter us in place, snap his fingers, wiggle his nose, blink his eyes, whatever, give us our new bodies, and then, raise people out of the grave, but don't have to raise them up in the air? What is the point of going up into the air and then coming right back down? What's the point of the movement going up? Right? It's like meaningless if we can't understand that there is a reason for rapture, which I'm not talking about right now, but I'm only focusing on the timing. We'll get to the reasons for rapture later on, but for now we're just looking at timing issues. So Walvoord continues, in effect, speaking of 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, where Paul introduces this idea of the day of the Lord, in effect, which he, by the way, goes on to write more prominently about in his second letter to the Thessalonians, particularly 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, where he introduces the idea of the man of lawlessness and the day of the Lord and things like that. So you dare not read 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5, 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5 without including 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. You got to read all three of those as one setting to get the full weight of why Paul brings all of these details together. And Walvoord's trying to kind of summarize that. He says, in effect, Paul is saying that the time of the rapture cannot be determined any more than the time of the beginning of the day of the Lord, but this is of no concern to believers because our appointment is not the wrath of the day of the Lord, but rather the salvation which is ours in Christ. The whole idea of the writing behind the letters to the Thessalonians was to comfort them for two main reasons that I can see. One was because they believed that they were experiencing tribulation and that they had missed the day, that they had missed the rapture, and that they'd missed the gathering together that Jesus talked about, and they believe that they were in the day of the Lord. And so Paul has to comfort them and say, no, you're not in the day of the Lord. That was the 2 Thessalonian letter where he talks about, hey, the day of the Lord will not happen until, then he gives these two events that have to happen before that. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. But the letter to the 1 Thessalonians, it has a lot of language where he says, comfort one another with these words, which is what? Comfort one another with the idea that those who have died in the Lord, you will indeed see again one day, because they're going to be resurrected, and then we who are alive are going to meet them. We're going to meet together. So the idea of comfort is the blessed hope of resurrection. And we can look forward to that as believers, whether we're alive or dead. We'll be together, not just with each other, but we'll be together with the Lord. So don't worry if you pass on before the Lord comes back. Remember that in the first century, they had every reason to expect that Jesus was going to return in their lifetime. I believe that's kind of the working idea of the expectation that they were working from, that they held, that Jesus would return within their lifetime, but they still didn't know exactly when. But they were kind of anticipating that the tribulation's heating up. Jesus is going to come, right? The temple got destroyed. We're fighting with the Romans, and then Jerusalem got sacked. I mean, a lot of events happened that probably caused the first century believers to have the idea that Jesus is returning soon. They didn't realize there was a 2,000-year delay. The point I'm trying to make, however, is that when we look at the Thessalonian letters as a whole, we need to keep this perspective in mind that rapture and day of the Lord are events that are written about from Paul's perspective because of the relationship to rapture to day of the Lord represents hope and rescue for believers, but retribution and payback for unbelievers. And resurrection is right in there. And so Paul's has to comfort his flock with those particular details.